Chapter 3. Size Matters, even in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, devotion to God was often measured by extravagance. The more elaborate and costly the demonstration of devotion, so the reasoning apparently went, the more likely it was to ensure God's favor, and to enhance the reputation of the city or town in which this demonstration could be seen. Of course, this honor rested not only on the leaders or citizens of the location, but also on the shoulders of those creating the works of art dedicated to God. Quality was certainly held in high regard, but even in the Middle Ages, bigger was often regarded as better. The town of Rothenburg ob der Tauber was no exception. Besides, Rothenburg, as a free imperial town, had a reputation to protect and the wealth to do so. The massive Jakobuskirche inside the town's walls was evidence of that. Few towns of this size could boast a church as impressive as theirs. It wasn't just the exterior of the church that impressed the citizens and visitors alike. The inside showcased an amazing hand-carved altar by the renowned Würzburg artist Tilman Riemenschneider. The piece was, indeed, a feather in the cap of the town. Known as the Holy Blood Altar, it was commissioned by the town council in 1499 to show off the town's Holy Blood relic. That was another feather in Rothenburg's cap. The church later became a Lutheran church, and Protestant churches frowned upon such displays, but the Protestants somehow managed to overlook this aberration. The whole town, after all, was proud of the church, inside and out, because it elevated the status of the town. That's why, when a dead body was found by the night watchman just outside the walls of the church in the middle of the night, it was considered a big deal. And that was why the town council rousted the town sleuth, Ewald the Czech, from his sleep long before sunrise. They didn't want news of this event to get out to the general public before they had the situation under control. Ewald the Czech was in the employ of the town leaders in a role that was intended to provide safety and security to the townspeople of Rothenburg. Ewald was always considered a bit of an outcast. As his surname suggested, he was not a native son of Rothenburg. The Czech state had come into existence in the late 9th century as the Duchy of Bohemia, which was part of the great Moravian Empire. Years later, Ewald's family had wandered west and eventually settled in Rothenburg. Even though his family had lived there for generations, he was still, in the parochial eyes of the townsfolk, known as the Czech, a reminder that he was, and always would be, an outsider. Ewald shrugged off such supercilious notions and simply went about his job. His job, however, was a bit unusual. Hundreds of years later, he might have been called an investigator or a detective. Such titles didn't exist in his time, so Ewald had no official title, another thing that made him a bit of an outsider. Still, the town fathers recognized his uncanny ability to ferret out clues about unlawful acts, and that enabled them to keep the peace in their small but prosperous town. That night, the town fathers had a significant need for Ewald's unique set of skills. A quick examination of the crumpled and smashed body found outside the Jakobuskirche revealed it to be the body of the master builder of the church. But how and why was it laying outside the church that he had designed and built? While death was not an infrequent visitor to Rothenburg, the citizens didn't react well to the untimely death of a prominent figure. And while sickness often took people in the prime of their lives, the violent taking of a life made the townsfolk nervous, and this death reeked of murder. That was precisely why the powers that be called for Ewald the Czech. They needed to get to the bottom of this story quickly and pass judgment with all haste. That was how they would convince the populace that their interests were being served by those in power. At first, Heinrich, the night watchman, thought he had stumbled upon some poor drunk who hadn't been able to make it home after a late-night visit to Ch3, the tavern that stayed open late to serve its less-than-sterling clientele. Heinrich assumed that the poor, besotted soul had simply made it as far as he could and had slumped against the wall of the church to sleep off the effects of his ale. Something, however, didn't look right. The body wasn't propped up against the wall of the church, and the limbs were splayed unnaturally. When he lowered his lantern for a closer look, he saw that the skull was crushed and that the man's lifeblood had spilled out into the street. Even though the skull had been badly damaged, it didn't take Heinrich more than a moment to recognize the face of the architect and builder of the Jakobuskirche, Georg Bauer. That was when he abandoned the rest of his normal nightly circuit and ran to the home of the town's burgomaster to inform him of the awful news. And while the burgomaster was initially quite put out to be disturbed from his slumbers, he quickly recognized the seriousness of the situation and sent messages to the other town leaders. The unspoken message was clear. If they, as leaders, couldn't assure the safety of their most prominent citizens, they would surely lose their influence and the wealth that went with it. That was why it didn't take long after the rousing of the town leaders for Ewald the Czech to be awakened from his peaceful slumbers. Shaking off his drowsiness in the cool, damp, early hours of the morning, Ewald approached the body with a sense of dread and confidence. He hated seeing the aftermath of violence. At the same time, he knew that the battered body would have a tale to tell. He simply had to observe, without preconception, what the evidence had to say. Ewald did what he always did. He focused on what was before him. He began with an examination of the body. That included, of course, not just the body itself, but with its exact location. On this point, he agreed with the night watchman, even though Heinrich was not held in high regard by the town's populace. Heinrich had been right. The body was too far from the wall of the church to have been bludgeoned while leaning against the exterior wall. In addition, the builder's purse, containing plenty of money, was still in his possession. His valuable rings were still on his fingers. His gold necklace was still around his neck, and a silver crucifix with a chain was still clutched in his right hand. This was not a robbery gone bad, not with so many valuable items left behind. As the night melted into dawn, Ewald took another look at the corpse. There was, however, no other evidence of violence. There were no stab wounds or other signs of physical abuse. That led him to consider a different possibility. Looking at the distance between the body and the outer wall of the church, Ewald had to consider the possibility of a fall. In fact, given the injuries Bauer had sustained, there was no other plausible explanation. But who would push Georg Bauer from the roof of his own church? As troubling as the question was, it also limited the suspects significantly. Not everyone had access to the upper levels of the church. But why would someone want to murder the man responsible for building one of the greatest buildings in Rothenburg? Ewald began to think. Georg Bauer was a citizen of good reputation. He wasn't a heavy drinker, and there were no rumors of him mistreating his wife. Bauer certainly had money, but this was obviously no robbery. Who had the means to perpetrate such a crime? Bauer wasn't a large man, but he wasn't small either. It was no easy task to throw a man off a roof. Then Ewald considered the matter of opportunity. Who else had access to the high roof of the church? The passageway leading there was hardly common knowledge. Ewald needed to do some digging, but he didn't have much time. The town leaders wanted answers soon to demonstrate to the public that they had the situation well in hand. So Ewald returned to the church and to Bauer's nearby home. Bauer and his wife shared a home not far from the church. While it wasn't opulent, it was one of the finer homes in town. After all, skills such as his had their privileges. Ewald knocked at the door of the builder's house and was let in by the servant. The builder's wife, a plump woman lacking in both physical and social graces that might set her apart, greeted him in the residence. Ewald couldn't help but think that the builder had met and married this woman before he had become recognized as a great designer and builder. And while there were no reports of Bauer mistreating his wife, neither were there tales of his undying love for her. There was an air about the woman that suggested she came from wealth and prestige, despite her somewhat dowdy appearance. Ewald wondered if perhaps this had been a marriage of convenience, where the talented but poor builder married the wealthy but unattractive woman of means. He had no proof, of course, but he knew how the world worked. Very few people in those days married exclusively for love. Of course it happened, but social improvement often trumped infatuation. The new widow was obviously distressed, but it wasn't clear to Ewald whether her discomfort came from the loss of her husband or from the loss of social status that would certainly accompany his demise. After offering his condolences, Ewald began to explain to the widow that he needed to review some of her husband's effects in an attempt to discover who might have done him harm. This was considered a novel idea at the time, and she was a bit taken aback. It appeared to be a colossal invasion of privacy, and she was disinclined to acquiesce. When Ewald explained to her that it might answer many questions about her husband's death and ensure her position of status in Rotenburg society, she agreed to allow him into her husband's study. Ewald needed answers quickly. That meant overlooking normal business details and focusing on the darker corners of the man's life. So he eschewed the man's daily business transactions and began searching for information that wouldn't be contained in daily business journals. He looked for evidence of abnormal behavior. He thought about the deceased builder's unattractive and frankly unpleasant wife. Successful men like Bauer didn't content themselves with women who wouldn't satisfy their appetites. They cast their eyes abroad for someone who offered them something more enticing. As Ewald surveyed the builder's bookshelves, his eye rested on a tome of poems. That was hardly a book that a man given to specific measurements and the laws of physics was likely to peruse. He pulled the volume from the shelf and began to leaf through it. Tucked inside was a note written in a feminine hand. Dearest one, how I treasure our stolen moments together, and how I long for the next time we can be together again. With his curiosity piqued, Ewald continued looking through the book and discovered another note in the same hand that read, My love, it would appear that our passion for one another has borne fruit that neither of us anticipated. Given your current state of affairs, what are we to do? And what if my situation is revealed to my father? I cannot bear this burden alone. You must help me deal with this situation. Your loving A. This mysterious A seemed like a potential suspect. Obviously, the relationship between A and the builder had progressed beyond mere infatuation. But an unmarried woman with child would have been an outcast in such a small, close-knit community. Her financial options, indeed her entire future existence, would have been dire. Had she tried to extort money from him? Had she threatened to expose him to his wife? Ewald had no evidence of that so far. But something bothered him. How would a young, unmarried woman lure the builder to the rooftop? How would she have access? It seemed much more likely that he might lure her there in an attempt to keep her quiet and preserve his reputation. She was obviously not a woman of consequence, not if she still lived with her father. Would she possess the strength to bodily throw Bauer off the roof so that he would land a yard or two from the wall? As his eyes continued to take in the contents of the builder's study, they came to rest upon a leather-bound journal that was a record of all the church parishioners. Why a builder would have this journal in his possession was unclear, but there it was, and it was obviously up to date. Each entry was dated. He began leafing through it, looking at the names. There were plenty of women's names that began with the letter A: Agatha, Anita, Anna, and more. But they were all either older and married or far too young to be a secret lover. Then he finally stumbled upon the name of Adelheid Zimmer. She was 17 years old enough to be married, but the record showed that she still lived with her father Rolf, who was, as his name Zimmer implied, a carpenter. Her mother was listed as deceased, having passed away 3 years before. Ewald glanced at the address. Klosterhof 7 was only a few blocks from the church. Committing the address to memory, Ewald set out to see if he could confirm that Adelheid Zimmer was the mysterious A. The sun was only beginning to shine its rays on the street of the town, which meant that there was a good chance that both Adelheid Zimmer and her father were still at home. Ewald knocked at the door of Klosterhof 7, and after a brief pause, the solid wooden door creaked open to reveal a young and attractive woman who was dressed and ready to begin her day. It was a respectable house, the kind of place one might expect a carpenter to occupy. There were no great works of art or fine tapestries adorning the walls. Still, it was clean and had adequate room for a man, his wife, and their daughter. Ewald introduced himself and showed the young woman his city credentials. After glancing at them, she cautiously invited him in. "Who in God's name would come to our door at this hour of the morning?" bellowed a voice from deep inside the house. "It's all right, Poppy," the young woman called out. "It's someone sent from the town council." "What in the name of St. Jakob do they want with the likes of us at this hour of the day?" came the bellicose reply as the carpenter appeared in the frame of the interior door. Ewald reintroduced himself, showing his credentials again. As the carpenter stared at them, unimpressed, Ewald realized that the man probably couldn't read, so he explained his position and that he was there to ask a few questions about something that had happened the previous night. "Well, I don't see what that's got to do with me or my daughter," exclaimed the carpenter. "And I've got work to do. I've got customers breathing down my neck for work that they just asked me to do a week ago." "No need to worry yourself, Master Carpenter." Ewald spread it on a little thick with the title of Master, simply to placate the man. "My simple questions are for your daughter about some things that happened yesterday. You need not worry." "Well, I don't know what she could tell you," replied the father. "She has her hands full taking care of this household since my wife died. I'm late, so I'll be off." And with that, the carpenter lumbered toward his shop at the back of his home. Ewald was left alone with a bewildered teenage girl who stared at him with questioning eyes. "I'm assuming you are Adelheid Zimmer?" Ewald asked. "Yes," replied the maiden cautiously. "How do you know my name?" With your forbearance, madam, Ewald continued, I'd like to ask you a few questions in private, without your father present. He could see the anxiety cross her face, but before she could voice her concern, he pressed on. Do you know Georg Bauman? Asked the investigator. Her wide-eyed stare answered the question before her lips made a sound. Yes, of course, she stammered. I worked for Herr Bauman as he was completing the construction of the Jakobuskirche. He had put me in charge of cleaning the interior of the church as he was putting the finishing touches on the towers. Ewald knew that he was treading upon sensitive ground when he gently asked, Can you describe for me your relationship to Master Bauman? He caught the faint blush that covered her face as she replied, I'm not sure exactly what you mean. Ewald held out the 2 notes he had taken from the builder's book of poetry and handed them to Adelheid. As she read them, her eyes filled with tears. Ewald hated this part of his job. He was not there to cause pain, but to find information. So, have you come to accuse me of adultery? The young woman said shakily. Women convicted of adultery were subject to public humiliation at the pillory in the center of town. How curious that the town fathers can pursue their affairs with impunity, she continued, but publicly punish those without power or money. That's not what this is about, replied Ewald evenly. I'm not here to judge or punish you. I just need more information. And with your father gone, it might be easier for you to tell me what I need to know. Adelheid stared at him and sensed a decency in him that she couldn't explain. Yes, she finally sighed, I often worked late, and Georg would show me his plans for the church and take me through the structure to show me how he had achieved his vision. It was all innocent at first. He was enthralled with the project, and I was amazed at someone who could take ideas from paper to reality. Of course, it moved on from there. Ewald didn't interrupt her as she paused. Georg was trapped in a marriage without love or passion. His wife was cold and unapproachable. Her only concern was wealth and securing her comfort. You may have noticed that they had no children. I confess that I was enthralled by a man with such vision and talent. That infatuation gave way to physical expression. We became lovers in stolen moments when we were both alone in the church. Ewald realized that this was the time to press the issue. And what were the results of your moments of passion? He asked, gesturing toward the notes she held in her hand. She looked at them and laughed bitterly. I thought I was with child, she whispered. My monthly visitor had not come. I didn't know what to do. Neither of us was prepared for this circumstance. And then, probed Ewald gently. As it turned out, said Adelheid, I was simply late. One day after writing this note, my normal flow returned. I was embarrassed by my panic and didn't contact Georg to tell him the news. So you didn't go to see him last night? Ewald asked. You never told him that you weren't with child? Not yet, said the young woman, but I need to let him know soon so that he doesn't worry unnecessarily. I still don't know how to move forward. We're in love, but he is married. After a long pause, Ewald softly said, Adelheid, Georg was found dead outside the walls of the Jakobuskirche in the middle of the night. The sob that caught in her throat before bursting out as a wail convinced him that she was indeed unaware of her lover's demise. I'm so sorry. If it is of any comfort, there is no need for your father to know what we've discussed. Never having been good at matters of the heart or at offering comfort, Ewald rose awkwardly from his seat and made his way to the door. Behind him, a sobbing Adelheid shook with grief, unable to look up from the floor. As he opened the door to let himself out, Ewald stammered, "I'm so terribly sorry." As he moved down the street in the early morning light, his mind jumped, rather guiltily, to the next logical step. If passion was not the key to the puzzle, the next logical thing to consider was money. And so, with a new focus, he headed back to Georg Bauer's study for more clues. Ewald knew he had to dig into financial matters. He needed to follow the money.